Isabella's first day at the restaurant dawned with a mixture of excitement and a hint of nervous energy. She had taken the job not just for the salary, though that was a welcome support, but also as a chance to immerse herself in something entirely her own, away from the issues waiting at home. She arrived at the small but bustling restaurant just as the morning rush was settling in. The fragrance of roasted coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air, grounding her in the moment. She was met by Benetton, the young manager, whose easy smile and relaxed demeanor instantly put her at ease. At only 21, Benetton seemed slightly older, but exuded a confidence that reassured her. "Welcome, Isabella," he greeted warmly, showing her around the kitchen. "I've heard good things about your cooking. Can't wait to see what you bring to the table." Isabella smiled back, feeling a spark of pride. Cooking had always been her quiet passion, a comforting ritual that allowed her to express herself when words fell short. As Benetton finished the tour, he handed her an apron and let her settle in. Orders began streaming in, one after another, but Isabella quickly found her rhythm. Her hands worked almost on instinct, chopping, stirring, and seasoning with a precise ease that caught even her by surprise. By noon, she was lost in the flow of the work, her mind focused entirely on perfecting each dish. The restaurant filled with the lively sounds of conversations, clinking plates, and laughter from the diners enjoying their meals. Her dishes were returning empty, and she noticed a few customers pointing her way with approving nods. One older couple even waved and mouthed, "Thank you." Isabella blushed, a small glow of pride spreading within her. As the lunch rush wound down, Benetton stopped by her station, his eyes lighting up. "Isabella, you've done an incredible job today," he said with genuine appreciation. "Our customers love your cooking." His words made her day, and the warm, affirming look in his eyes seemed to carry more weight than she expected. For once, she felt seen, not just as a capable cook, but as someone with a unique touch. She finished her shift on a high, ready to head home, savoring the small victories of the day. The next day brought a new addition to the team. She was introduced to Richard, a young man with an easygoing smile and a quick wit that made her laugh almost instantly. He had joined the restaurant as a cook as well, and though he was new, he had an effortless charm. They spent the afternoon cooking side by side, sharing small anecdotes and jokes as they worked through the orders. Isabella felt an unexpected ease around him, as if they had known each other longer than just a day. He seemed to understand the rhythm of the kitchen, picking up on her cues and matching her pace, and she was glad for his company. As the evening wore on, Isabella found herself genuinely enjoying her work. The kitchen, once a place of silent duty, now felt alive with their shared efforts and small moments of laughter. For the first time in a while, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. After wrapping up her shift, she bid farewell to Benetton and Richard, a smile lingering on her face as she stepped out of the restaurant into the cooling night. She began the walk home, her mind drifting over the highlights of her day: Richard's jokes, the customers' smiles, and Benetton's words of praise all mixed together in a pleasant blur. Her footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, the familiar streets offering a sense of calm. But as she approached the park near her home, a muffled noise came from the shadows by the garden path she was crossing. A faint rustle, almost like hurried whispers, broke the evening's quiet. Isabella's steps faltered for a split second, her senses alert. She glanced toward the garden, shadows stretching under the dim lights, yet nothing appeared out of the ordinary. She briefly considered stopping to investigate, but quickly dismissed the thought. The comfort of her day still lingered, and she wasn't about to let an odd noise disrupt her good mood. Instead, she quickened her pace, leaving the mystery of the garden behind. By the time she reached her house, she had already brushed the noise aside, chalking it up to her imagination, or perhaps just a stray animal. She slipped inside, greeting the familiar silence, her thoughts still lingering on the successes of her first day. The restaurant, with its lively energy and her small growing connections with Benetton and Richard, seemed to offer something she had been missing, a place to belong, to build a life on her own terms. As she drifted off to sleep that night, a faint smile touched her lips, the hint of something bright on the horizon. The restaurant hummed with its usual energy, and Isabella was immersed in her work, finely tuning the flavors of each dish she prepared. She moved with practiced ease, enjoying the rhythm of her hands and the warmth of the kitchen. Then, suddenly, her concentration was shattered by a loud, angry voice cutting through the dining area. "Are you crazy? What kind of food is this?" The words were sharp, and their tone laced with disgust. Isabella froze, spoon hovering over a pan, as the other chefs glanced around uneasily. Instinctively, she wiped her hands and moved towards the seating area to find the source of the commotion. At one of the tables near the back, a middle-aged man was standing, his face red with indignation as he gestured angrily toward his plate. Customers at nearby tables were watching with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Isabella caught sight of Benetton making his way over, his expression concerned but calm. She reached the table just as he did, her stomach twisting with nervousness. "What seems to be the issue, sir?" Benetton asked, his tone polite yet steady. "This!" The man jabbed a finger at his plate, where an odd, dark piece of meat lay among the vegetables. Isabella's brow furrowed as she peered closer. At first glance, it looked like chicken, but something was unmistakably off. The texture seemed wrong, the color slightly unnatural, and a sour, pungent smell rose from the piece, almost turning her stomach. Benetton leaned in, inspecting the dish with a subtle frown. The man folded his arms, clearly waiting for an apology. With a nod, Benetton turned to Isabella and gestured toward the kitchen. "Please prepare a fresh plate for the gentleman," he instructed calmly. Then, he turned back to the customer with a reassuring smile. "We apologize, sir. I'll make sure you receive a replacement right away." Isabella hurried back to the kitchen, aware that her cheeks were flushed. She quickly joined the other cooks in preparing a new dish, focusing intensely on getting every detail right. After a few moments, Benetton returned with a polite nod to each of them. "I know all of you are doing your best," he said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to soften the tension in the room. "Mistakes happen, and I'm not here to blame anyone. Just keep doing what you're doing." Relieved, Isabella gave him a small nod. She had half expected a lecture, or at least a reminder to be careful. But Benetton's understanding put her at ease. "Thank you, Benetton," she murmured. He acknowledged her gratitude with a brief smile before leaving to check on the dining area again. When her shift finally ended, Isabella gathered her things and started her walk home. The restaurant was quieter than usual as she stepped outside, her mind replaying the strange incident from earlier. She couldn't shake the image of that odd piece of meat, and the memory left an uneasy feeling lingering in her chest. As she approached the park near her home, a soft, almost indistinct noise drifted over from the shadowed garden path. It was faint, a rustling sound, like someone, or something, was moving through the underbrush. Isabella paused briefly, her gaze flicking toward the garden, but nothing appeared out of place. Still, that unsettling feeling crept back, and with a shiver, she continued home, trying to brush off the encounter. The following morning at the restaurant, Isabella was greeted by an unusual hush. The usual chatter of the kitchen staff was replaced with hushed conversations, their voices laced with an almost nervous curiosity. She slipped into the kitchen, catching snippets of murmured words. "He went missing right after he left." "Last night," the man who complained. Her stomach twisted as she pieced together the words. She found one of her co-workers, a waiter named Theo, and asked in a low voice, What happened? Who's missing? Theo's eyes were wide. The customer who complained last night. Remember him? Apparently, he disappeared just after he left the restaurant. His family couldn't reach him, and no one's seen him since. Isabella's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't known him, of course, but the thought of someone simply vanishing like that left a cold sensation creeping down her spine. Theo leaned closer, whispering. Benetton mentioned it to some of us earlier. He's been trying to keep it low-key, but everyone's talking about it now. The news lingered in her mind as she worked. She couldn't shake the disturbing image of the man's face as he had argued with Benetton, or the way he had left the restaurant, muttering in frustration. Isabella's thoughts drifted as she chopped vegetables and stirred sauces, the routine motions oddly comforting. But her focus was soon disrupted again when she felt an odd sense of scrutiny. She glanced up and noticed Richard watching her from across the kitchen. His expression was intense, his eyes moving carefully from one cook to another, as if he were studying each of them in turn. His gaze was unsettling, not because of any malice, but due to the unspoken question it seemed to carry. "Richard," she said, her voice breaking the silence between them. "Do you need something?" He blinked, his stare breaking, and a slight smile crept over his face. "No, nothing. Thanks for asking." But even as he returned to his work, Isabella felt a faint, lingering sense of discomfort. Richard's behavior seemed odd. It wasn't like him to be so watchful. She shrugged it off, trying to refocus on her tasks. Maybe he was just as rattled as she was. Later that day, a ripple of gasps and murmurs erupted in the restaurant as the televisions mounted above the bar flickered with breaking news. Isabella's breath caught when she glanced at the screen and saw the headline, "Body Found Near Local Garden." Her heart sank as she read on, her gaze fixed on the details emerging in the news anchor's steady voice. The man's body, the same customer who had vanished the night before, had been discovered in the very garden she walked past every night. The familiar stretch of park flashed on the screen, now cordoned off with yellow police tape, and her stomach churned at the sight. Her mind raced, piecing together the strange noise she had heard, the missing man, and now this dreadful news. She hadn't known him, but his last moments had been in her restaurant. He had sat in her section, eating food from her kitchen. And now he was gone, lost to some horrific fate that she couldn't begin to understand. She looked over at Richard, half expecting to see that same intensity in his eyes. But he was focused on the screen, his gaze narrowed as though he were picking up on some detail that everyone else missed. A knot tightened in Isabella's chest. That garden, those nightly noises, what could they mean? As the day wore on, Isabella found herself trapped in a web of questions she couldn't shake. She could feel the weight of something unexplainable pressing against the edges of her reality, and all she could do was brace herself for whatever lay ahead. As the evening shadows deepened, Isabella stood outside the restaurant, a shiver creeping over her at the thought of walking home alone. The memory of the missing customer, now found dead in the garden she passed each night, had haunted her all day, leaving her uneasy about the path that lay ahead. She glanced back at the restaurant's warm glow and decided to ask Benetton for a favor. "Benetton," she began tentatively, as he was stacking some order slips. "Would you mind dropping me off tonight? I'd feel a lot better about it." He gave her an apologetic look, his brow furrowing slightly. "I wish I could, Isabella. But you know I always stay back to finish up the paperwork. It'll take at least 2 more hours tonight." He offered a reassuring smile. "You'll be all right, though, right?" She tried to mask her disappointment, giving a small smile instead. "Of course. Thank you anyway." Just as she turned to leave, she noticed Richard heading toward the exit. Seizing the moment, she called out, "Richard, could you maybe walk with me tonight?" Richard looked momentarily taken aback, his eyes clouded with confusion, but then he shrugged lightly. "Sure, no problem." As they started down the familiar route, Isabella felt a small measure of comfort. Richard, with his relaxed, almost indifferent attitude, didn't seem fazed by the strange events of the past days, and his presence kept her mind from spiraling. But as they approached the garden, Isabella's steps slowed instinctively. Her throat felt dry, and her eyes fixed on the dense shadows between the trees, almost bracing for the eerie sounds she'd heard on so many nights. Yet, tonight, there was only silence. The absence of noise was almost unnerving in itself. She kept glancing at the shadows, as if expecting something to emerge, while Richard strode forward, seemingly unbothered, his attention elsewhere. The garden looked ordinary, almost innocent, yet the memory of that murdered customer lingered ominously in her mind. She was relieved to be crossing the final stretch, her gaze still lingering on the trees, half expecting something strange to surface from the darkness. As they reached her house, Isabella gave Richard a quiet thanks before heading inside. Sleep didn't come easily. She lay in bed, thoughts racing, replaying every detail: the missing customer, the gruesome discovery, the silence in the garden that felt like it was hiding something. She struggled to rest, drifting off only as the night wore on. The next day, Isabella arrived at the restaurant early, hoping the familiar work routine would distract her. But as she entered, she immediately noticed Benetton in a low, tense conversation with the restaurant owner near the kitchen entrance. The owner's voice was barely above a whisper, and his expression was taut, almost grim. She glanced around, seeing her fellow cooks casting uneasy glances at the two men, their faces reflecting the tension filling the air. Isabella quickly moved away to start her preparations, though her mind kept circling back to what Benetton and the owner might be discussing. Richard was already slicing vegetables when Isabella joined him. She offered a warm, "Good evening," hoping to clear the discomfort that had settled between them since last night. He gave a casual smile. "Good evening, Isabella." But his eyes held a hint of something more, a guarded look that seemed oddly detached. He turned back to his work, his movements precise and unhurried, as if nothing unusual had happened. Just then, the clattering of silverware and a loud voice rang out from the dining area. Isabella's head snapped up as an elderly woman's indignant tone cut through the restaurant, her words sharp with anger. "What are these?" she demanded, her voice echoing across the room. Isabella's stomach tightened as she exchanged a quick glance with Richard, who didn't seem remotely concerned. She moved to the front, where she found Benetton already standing by the woman's table, his hands raised in a calming gesture, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, I apologize if there's been a mistake. Let me see what happened here." The woman's face was contorted with shock, her hands hovering above her plate as though unwilling to touch the contents. Benetton leaned in, his face growing pale as he inspected her meal. Nestled among the greens and roasted vegetables was something that no one should ever find on their plate, a piece that looked unmistakably like a human thumb. A faint murmur spread among the nearby tables as other customers strained to see, their curiosity shifting to alarm. Isabella felt a chill settle over her. The strange meat from the other night was disturbing enough, but this was beyond anything she could comprehend. The restaurant's usual hum of voices faded to a tense silence, everyone's attention fixed on Benetton as he carefully lifted the plate away from the woman. His eyes swept the room briefly, as if gauging the staff's reactions, before he brought the plate back to the kitchen. Isabella glanced at Richard, expecting to see the same shock she felt mirrored on his face. But to her surprise, he was calmly sautéing vegetables, his eyes fixed on his skillet with an almost indifferent concentration. It was as if he hadn't heard anything, as if the horrifying discovery in the dining area was of no consequence to him. Isabella's mind whirled, unsettled by his detachment. Benetton returned to the kitchen, holding the plate carefully in both hands. His face was tense, and he looked from one chef to another, his voice low. "I don't know how this happened, but if that customer decides to tell anyone, we could be facing serious trouble. We need to be absolutely sure nothing like this ever happens again." The other chefs murmured apologies, their voices hushed and anxious. Each one seemed genuinely distressed, their faces pale and fearful. Yet Richard, standing at his station, continued working, his expression unchanged, as if oblivious to the tension that gripped everyone around him. Isabella found his reaction unsettling, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read him, but he remained stoic, absorbed in his work. Finally, when the murmurs died down, Benetton left the kitchen to reassure the diners. Isabella took a small step toward Richard, a question forming in her mind. "Aren't you even a bit worried?" she asked softly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "It's hard to believe something so horrific could happen by accident." Richard looked up at her, a slight smile curving his lips. "What do you want me to say, Isabella? I'm here to cook, not to worry about what's on someone's plate." His tone was light, almost dismissive, and he turned back to his work without another word. Frustration prickled at her. She couldn't fathom how he could be so unaffected by everything. Sighing, she resumed her own tasks, her mind racing. She couldn't ignore the strange sense of dread that hung over her, or the way Richard's reaction left a bitter taste in her mouth. As the night wound down, Isabella prepared to leave, bracing herself for another tense walk home. But before she could step outside, Benetton approached her, his face visibly softened. "Hey, Isabella," he said. "Tonight I'll be leaving early, so if you'd like, I can walk with you." Relief washed over her. "That would be great. Thank you." The two of them set off, the cool night air offering a refreshing contrast to the tension that had permeated the restaurant. They spoke lightly about work, about Benetton's experiences managing a restaurant, but Isabella's mind remained partially on edge, waiting for the moment they would reach the garden. Before they even neared it, a sound broke the stillness of the night, a faint, rustling noise that rose and fell, carrying through the cool air. Benetton's footsteps slowed, his head tilting slightly as he listened, his face tightening in curiosity. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella felt a strange mix of relief and unease at his question. "Yes. It's been happening every night," she admitted, her voice wavering slightly. She went on to explain everything: the noises, the silence last night, the uneasy feeling that never quite left her as she walked past. Benetton's gaze sharpened, his face thoughtful as he glanced at the dense shadows in the garden. "I wonder. We don't know what's back there. Maybe it's worth taking a look." Isabella's pulse quickened. She felt a pull toward the garden, a strange urge to find out what lay hidden within its shadows. But her instincts warned against it, an unexplainable sense of danger gnawing at her. "Benetton, maybe it's better to leave it alone," she cautioned, her voice firmer than she intended. "We don't know what we might find." Benetton hesitated, his eyes lingering on the garden, but he eventually nodded, pulling back from the edge of the path. They continued on, walking in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the night as quiet and empty as before, but the lingering unease refused to fade. When they finally reached her house, Isabella gave Benetton a quiet thank you, and he offered a small wave before heading off into the darkness. She watched him disappear down the street, the stillness settling around her once more, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Inside, her thoughts returned to the restaurant, to the terrifying incidents that seemed to keep piling up, and to Richard's strange reaction to it all. Isabella lay awake for hours, the memory of the thumb-piece and the garden sounds playing over and over in her mind. The mystery of the garden, the strange sounds, and Richard's detached demeanor were pieces of a puzzle she was now determined to solve. Sleep had been elusive for Isabella. She tossed and turned through the night, her mind tangled in thoughts of Richard's unsettling behavior, the strange sounds from the garden, and the eerie events unfolding at the restaurant. As dawn began to break, she gave up on sleep and decided to do something out of the ordinary, go for a morning walk. She hoped the cool morning air might calm her nerves and push away the shadows that seemed to cling to her thoughts. It was early enough that the streets were empty, save for the occasional call of a distant bird. Her feet carried her without much thought, and soon she found herself near the road that bordered the garden. Her steps slowed as she passed it, the memories of that hidden, dense stretch of trees surfacing. Just then, a sudden movement caught her eye. Richard was sprinting out from the trees, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something, or someone. Isabella stopped short, her eyes widening in shock. He was disheveled, his face pale, and worst of all, a splash of red stained his shirt. The sight was chilling, and her mind raced with questions. Why would Richard be in the garden so early? And what was he doing with blood on his clothes? She watched as he hurried down the street, his expression tense, his eyes darting about. Summoning her courage, Isabella began to follow him from a distance, staying close enough to watch but not be seen. But just as suddenly as he had appeared, he vanished down an alleyway, leaving her staring at the empty street, her mind awash with confusion. The unsettling memory lingered as she returned home, where she tried to shake off the encounter with a hot cup of coffee. But the image of Richard, his hasty retreat, his blood-stained shirt, remained vivid. As she prepared for the day, she found herself dreading her shift at the restaurant, yet there was a gnawing urge to piece together what was happening. When she arrived, she found Benetton and discreetly pulled him aside. She needed answers. The morning's strange encounter had left her with more questions than she could handle on her own. "Benetton, can I talk to you privately?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He noticed the seriousness in her eyes and led her to a quiet corner. "What's going on, Isabella?" he asked, looking concerned. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I saw Richard this morning, running from the garden, and he had blood on his shirt. Benetton, I think something's very wrong with him. Maybe he's even connected to the murder somehow. We can't keep him here. It's not safe for any of us." Benetton's face tensed. He looked at her intently, as if weighing her words. "Are you absolutely sure about what you saw?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the clatter of kitchen preparations. "Yes, I'm sure. He's dangerous," Isabella insisted. "We need to tell the owner. Get him out of here before something else happens." Benetton sighed, his hand running over his face in frustration. "I understand, but removing him isn't my decision to make. I'll talk to the owner about it, though. This is serious." Feeling a flicker of relief, Isabella left the conversation, hoping the matter would be dealt with. But as she returned to her work, she noticed something peculiar. Benetton was speaking to Richard, his voice low, almost inaudible, his expression unreadable. And as Richard glanced around and noticed Isabella watching, he abruptly stepped away, resuming his tasks as if nothing had happened. Isabella's thoughts swirled. Why was Benetton talking to Richard instead of informing the owner? Was he trying to protect him, or was there something she was missing? Later that day, Richard approached her with an unexpected request. "Isabella, "Let's take a walk after work," he said, his voice unusually insistent. Every instinct told her to decline. She no longer felt safe around him. Something about him seemed dark, dangerous. "I don't think that's a good idea, Richard," she replied cautiously, trying to hide her unease. But Richard didn't back down. "Please, Isabella. It's important." His eyes held a quiet desperation, and she felt the trap close around her. She had no choice. Reluctantly, she agreed, and they set off together after closing. The silence between them felt heavy, neither willing to break it, until Richard finally spoke. "I know you don't trust me, Isabella, and after this morning, I don't blame you." He looked at her, his face serious, almost vulnerable. "But I need you to understand. I'm not the one you should be afraid of." She frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "It's Benetton," Richard said, his voice hushed, though the streets were empty. "He's more dangerous than you realize." Isabella stared at him, her mind reeling. "You can't be serious. Benetton has been nothing but kind and responsible. Why would you say that?" "Because I know what he really is," Richard whispered, his tone steady, but his face grim. He's a werewolf, Isabella. He hunts at night. That's why I was in the garden this morning. I was running from him. He attacked me last night." Isabella struggled to process his words, disbelief and fear clashing within her. "A werewolf? Richard, do you have any idea how insane that sounds?" "I know," he replied, his gaze earnest, "but I'm telling you the truth. He's been trying to control it, to hide it, but something's changed. And now, I'm afraid he's putting all of us in danger." She tried to steady herself, grappling with the implications of his story. "But you were talking to him earlier. If he's so dangerous, why would you?" Richard sighed, looking away. "I was trying to reason with him, to tell him to leave us alone, but I don't think he'll listen. Last night was different. He's losing control." They continued in silence until they reached Isabella's house. She couldn't bring herself to trust Richard entirely, but there was something about his fear, his words, that unsettled her. She thanked him briefly and closed the door behind her, her mind spinning with questions and doubt. The following day at work, Isabella was on edge. She kept a wary eye on both Benetton and Richard, unsure whom to trust. Mid-shift, she glanced over and noticed Benetton standing alone, muttering under his breath, his face blank but intense. It looked as though he was arguing with himself, though his words were too quiet to hear. The sight sent a chill through her. She was beginning to feel trapped, caught between two sides of a story with no way of knowing the truth. Just as she was contemplating quitting her job altogether, a commotion broke out in the kitchen. She saw a server reaching for a plate of food that had just been set for delivery to a customer. Isabella's gaze froze on the plate, and her stomach churned. There, nestled among the pieces of chicken, was a strange, fleshy morsel that looked disturbingly familiar. Her eyes darted to Benetton, who was watching the server with an odd, almost detached expression. The piece looked horrifyingly like human flesh, and Benetton was allowing it to be served without a second thought. Without wasting a moment, Isabella rushed over to Richard, her voice barely controlled. "Richard, look at that plate," she whispered, pointing subtly to the dish in question. He followed her gaze, and his expression tightened as he took in the sight. Without a word, he strode over to the server, intercepting the plate. He carried it back to the kitchen, his hands steady as he discreetly removed the suspicious piece and set it aside. Then, he rearranged the food and returned the plate, taking it to the customer himself. When he returned, Benetton's face was tense, his eyes fixed on Richard with a dark, unreadable expression. It was subtle, but Isabella could see a spark of anger there, barely restrained. Isabella's suspicion only grew. She didn't know who to believe, Benetton, the reliable, responsible manager, or Richard, whose story painted Benetton as something far more sinister. But she couldn't ignore what she had just witnessed, or the quiet rage that seemed to burn in Benetton's eyes. As the day wore on, she found herself watching every move, every glance, every whispered conversation between them. The truth felt just out of reach, yet one thing was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Whoever was responsible, she was caught in the middle of something far darker than she had ever imagined. Isabella walked beside Richard, her gaze trailing along the street as she mulled over the tangled mysteries of the past few days. Shadows lingered in her mind as heavily as the night that shrouded them, but for now, Richard's story was the only thing that made sense to her. He had claimed to know the truth about Benetton, that Benetton was an ancient werewolf cursed for his vicious past, preying on innocents, smuggling flesh into the restaurant's food, and all the while hiding in plain sight as a charming restaurant manager. It was chilling and convincing, yet left her shaken to her core. As she approached her house, Richard paused. "Remember, Isabella," he said, his voice low and resolute. "Stay away from Benetton. There are things you don't know about him, things that could hurt you." The words clung to her mind long after she said goodbye. She lay awake, haunted by the scene in the locked room, by the horrors of human flesh hidden in the dark, by the sharp, chilling howl she'd heard on the night walk. Yet, doubts about Richard crept in too. Could he be manipulating her? And if so, to what end? The next morning she gathered her courage, arriving at the restaurant with her resignation in hand. The earlier sense of curiosity was gone, replaced by a need to escape the suffocating presence of secrets and fear. But as soon as she entered, Benetton intercepted her, his face a blend of concern and a knowing edge. "Isabella," he said softly, "you're behaving differently. Is something wrong? Have I done something to upset you?" She forced herself to hold his gaze. "No, Benetton, it's just everything. The murder, the strangeness. I think I need a change." A silence fell, tense yet delicate, as he seemed to search her face. Finally, he sighed, nodding slightly, almost defeated. "Very well, Isabella. But please know that you're invaluable here. Whatever you need, I'm willing to do to keep you on our team." He paused, as if weighing his words, and then added, "Even double your pay." His eyes held a warmth that clashed with the suspicions swirling inside her. She wanted to believe he was innocent, that he wasn't the monster Richard claimed him to be, but fear and doubt had a way of distorting trust. Forcing a polite smile, she shook her head. "I'm sorry, Benetton. I just don't feel safe." Later, as she worked through her shift, she couldn't shake the sense of something out of place. In a quiet hallway near a rarely used room, she spotted a peculiar piece of flesh on the floor. Unlike anything from the kitchen, it was suspiciously human. She turned to the nearest chef, a man named Marcus, and asked him about the locked room. "That room?" He shrugged. "It's always been locked. Nobody goes in there." Her skin prickled with fear, but before she could ask anything more, Marcus hurried away, muttering about an order that needed his attention. Isabella's mind raced with questions she was too afraid to answer. When her shift finally ended, she grabbed her coat and stepped into the night. The quiet streets only fed her nerves as she walked. The stillness was unnerving, and she thought she heard faint, distant howls. She broke into a brisk walk, pressing forward, but something made her pause near the garden. The shadows in the trees shifted, and a hulking, four-legged creature emerged, eyes gleaming in the moonlight. A werewolf. Her breath caught as it drew closer, its gaze focused, its teeth bared. Then a figure leapt in her path. Benetton. Or at least, the man she thought was Benetton, but who in her terrified mind now seemed inseparable from the monstrous creature before her. Her mind screamed to flee, and without a second thought, she turned and ran home, feeling the heavy gaze of the werewolf on her back the entire way. The next day, resignation letter in hand, she arrived at the restaurant, resolved to leave for good. Benetton approached her, confused and concerned, and asked, "Why did you run away last night?" Isabella, I just wanted to talk." She swallowed hard. "I can't do this, Benetton. I can't stay here anymore." Before he could respond, a chef she barely knew approached her, gesturing for her to follow him into the shadows near the storeroom. "You might want to see something," he whispered. Though every instinct told her to refuse, her curiosity won. He held up a ring of keys, unlocked the door to the dark room, and opened it just enough for her to peer inside. The sight turned her stomach. Shelves filled with pieces of flesh, preserved with chemicals to dull the scent, but unmistakable for what they were. She stumbled back, bile rising in her throat, and the chef silently closed the door and walked away. She turned to leave, but Benetton was already there, watching her, his face blank. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. She could only shake her head, speechless, as she pushed past him and hurried out of the restaurant. On her way home, she barely noticed the growing silence of the streets until it was broken by the same unearthly howl. She froze, pulling out her phone and calling the police, her voice trembling as she described an animal lurking nearby. But as she hung up, she saw the werewolf, its menacing figure closing in on her with disturbing speed. She turned to run, but it was too late. The creature slashed at her, sending a wave of pain tearing through her side. Just as she fell, another figure appeared, moving with a strange, shadowy grace, leaping into a fierce clash with the werewolf. This was no ordinary human. It was a vampire, fangs bared, hissing, fighting with an agility she'd never seen. They clashed brutally, but the werewolf was stronger, knocking the vampire to the ground repeatedly. Watching the chaos from her place on the ground, Isabella's mind reeled. It was like stepping into a nightmare she couldn't wake from, the creatures before her both terrifying and inexplicable. And yet, there was something familiar about the vampire's movements, something that reminded her, strangely, of Richard. The police arrived, and gunshots rang out, startling the creatures. The werewolf fell, and the vampire disappeared into the shadows. They helped her up, asking questions she could barely answer, her mind still spinning from the scene. That night, Isabella lay awake, recounting every detail to her father. He was silent, listening with a gravity she hadn't expected. When she finished, he leaned back and said, "There have been rumors of a werewolf around here for as long as I can remember. Your grandmother used to tell me stories of an ancient vampire who protected this town from creatures like it. I always thought they were just tales." As he spoke, she felt a strange comfort, as if these mysteries had always been lurking around her, hidden just beneath the surface. The next morning, Isabella returned to the restaurant to collect her final paycheck. She was stunned to find Benetton waiting, smiling warmly. "Isabella," he greeted her, his voice soft yet somehow carrying an edge of pleading. "Please don't leave. I know it seems strange, but you're safe here, safer than you think." She held back a shudder, still wary, but he continued, "I know this job doesn't seem perfect, but you're valuable to us, to me. I could raise your pay, change your hours, anything." His tone held a sincerity that unnerved her, and his eyes, they held a sadness, an ache, that she couldn't quite place. She stared, almost entranced, until she shook herself free of his gaze. "Thank you, Benetton. But I think it's time for me to move on." As she left, she felt a pang of sadness she hadn't expected, a lingering sense of something left unsaid. Later that night, as she walked home, a group of teenage boys started following her, making crude comments, their voices echoing in the empty streets. She quickened her pace, but they only came closer, laughing. One reached for her, and she shouted, but nobody answered. And then, suddenly, a figure emerged, the same vampire from before. The boys froze, laughing nervously, assuming it was a prank. But as soon as he moved, swift and lethal, they realized their mistake, scattering in all directions. Isabella's fear vanished, replaced by a strange certainty. She called out, "Richard, is that you?" The vampire paused, turning back to her with a faint smile, but as she stepped closer, she felt a shock run through her. She saw his eyes, warm, sorrowful eyes that weren't Richard's at all. They were Benetton's. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Benetton! But—" He stepped closer, his face softening with a look of deep, quiet pain. "I didn't want you to find out this way, Isabella," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I tried to keep you safe from all this. From me." Tears stung her eyes as the truth unraveled before her. All the times she'd thought he was her enemy, it had been Benetton who had watched over her, fought for her, loved her from afar. The secrets, the mysteries, all of it had been to protect her. She couldn't hold back anymore. She stepped forward, placing her hand on his cheek. "Benetton, I had no idea." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. "I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to know. But it was too dangerous. And even now, I fear that loving me will bring you nothing but pain." She shook her head, her heart swelling with a fierce resolve. "No, I don't care what you are. You saved me. You loved me when I was too blind to see it." Without another word, she leaned up and kissed him, letting the truth settle between them. A love born from the darkest of secrets, yet undeniable, and for the first time, real.